Your life can be full of inspiration and magic, and you don't need glass slippers to get there. Welcome to the podcast for real life heroines with author, speaker, and coach, Susanna Liller. Join us as we work with key elements of personal development to assist you in hearing the calls that life has for you. Be inspired, be empowered, and be encouraged. Let's start today's episode with your host, Susanna Liller.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me on my podcast for Real Life Heroines. And I am really pleased to have Shirley Hager as my guest this time for this episode. Shirley, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Shirley is an author. We're going to hear about her book that she published this year called The Gathering. But if you've been listening to these podcasts, you'll know that what they're about is telling the story of the heroine and the heroine's journey. So as much as we will talk about Shirley's book, which we will, we want to hear about her journey in, well, we're going to have to get into it because something came before her actual writing of the book. And let me also just say that Shirley has a background in facilitation, and she was part of the Center for Vision and
Policy. Center for Vision and Policy.
Right. Which, can you just say a few words about what that was? Because I think that was the starting point maybe for this work.
It was the starting point for this specific work, yes. Back in the 1980s, there was an organization based in Maine called the Center for Vision and Policy. And it was a peace and justice organization, you might say, but it had this particular focus where it wanted to bring together thinking of social, economic, and environmental justice.
Right.
And to sort of interweave those themes in order to create a vision for how we could all live sustainably. Not only in Maine, but in the Gulf of Maine bioregion.
And you were coordinator for that group.
I was not the coordinator for the whole organization, but I became the coordinator for the gatherings that brought together Wabanaki and non-native people.
Which is the whole subject of your book. Yes.
Right.
But just a little more context around you and your background. You grew up in the South in North Carolina, and say a bit about how that your upbringing there affected you as a person and the work that you chose to do.
Well, yes, I grew up in North Carolina in the 50s and 60s. So that means I grew up during segregation. And I would say that it's a pretty confusing way to grow up. I'm sure whether you're white or black in that situation, because things don't make sense is kind of how I think about it. I just remember being so confused by the things that I would see and the things that would be said by people in my life who were loving people. They were kind to me, but then they would say these things about other people that just, you couldn't make sense of it. And I remember, one of the things that I tell in the book is that just like every other child in that era, I watched Westerns. And the thing that I remember is that I never somehow absorbed the message that the, quote, Indians in the Westerns were the enemy. I was always fascinated by them and how they lived. And I wanted to live the way that they lived. And I remember this time, I must have been about 8 years old, and I came home from school And I remember something must have happened during the day that really bothered me, and that I had seen a Black person or maybe a child treated badly. And I was asking my dad, and I remember asking him, why was that person treated this way? And my father was a very compassionate man, and he had a bit more worldly experience. Like he grew up in Missouri, he joined the military, and then he finished college on the GI Bill, and he was stationed in Colorado for a while. And so what he said to me was, well, you know, I think some people treat other people that way to make themselves feel big. And he said, when I was stationed out west, they treated the Indians just the way they treat, he would have said colored people back then, just the way that we treat colored people here.
Right.
And I just remember this like light bulb. It was like, well, then suddenly it all seemed wrong. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just remember feeling like, well, if they can treat Indians that way, also, then this doesn't make sense to me.
Right. I remember you saying to me when we talked earlier that it just didn't feel right in you. And even though you were young, as you continued to move forward in your career, and you would have this, you had this value system that you just knew what was right. And so then that brought you to this social justice group, and also you're a Quaker. Mm-hmm. And also you were part of the Center for Courage and Renewal and did work there. So this kind of all laid the groundwork. So I'm getting ready to ask you, Shirley, what call did you have? And explain what that was, what that then, for everyone, the call is what takes us on our heroine's journey if we accept the call. And so what came to you?
Well, I would say that, as I said, I had this lifelong, although romantic, curiosity, interest in indigenous peoples and cultures. And I went to graduate school out in Utah. I was aware that there was a strong Native presence out there, but I never met any students on campus. I just never had that kind of opportunity, although I thought about it. And so then when I moved to Maine, and I became involved in a Quaker organization in Southern Maine that sort of led me to hearing about the Center for Vision and Policy. And so I just decided to meet the founder of the center one morning for breakfast to sort of see what they were up to. And so the founder, Ellie Haney, was telling me about this vision, that they were trying to construct of sustainability. But they had this idea that was pretty unique at the time. And that was that they wanted to make sure that they had the voice of the indigenous people who had lived in this area, in this region, in this territory for millennia. They wanted to include their voice in this vision. And I was immediately hooked, as you might imagine, because this is what I'd been interested in so long. And so I wanted to know how I could be involved. And I had in my very purse at the time, I had this brochure advertising a New England-wide gathering of Quakers that I was planning to go to in a few weeks. And there was a man there who was going to be giving a talk on Native spirituality. And he had been invited by the Quakers because he was Wampanoag, and they were holding the meeting in Massachusetts that year. And so I said, well, I'm going to go and I'll talk to this person. And Ellie they had some ideas about how they might approach this. So that's what happened. I was just drawn to investigate this. I went to the presentation by this man whose name I couldn't pronounce at the time, but his name was Gisatanamuk. And he did 3 afternoons of speaking about his world, his people's worldview, and so on. And so in that time period, I went up to him and I talked to him about the Center for Vision and Policy. And he was very intrigued because he said that he had, we said that we were interested in learning from the people of the land. And he said he had never heard white people use that term before.
Wow. So
that's exactly how he thought of himself.
And that's something. And this would be 1980.
86. That would have been 1986 that I met him.
And he's in your book.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so, meaning he's part of this group, which you're going to tell us about. But mm-hmm. wasn't he was young, like in his 20s or something?
Well, we were both, he was more
young.
40s. We were young, but we were in our 40s.
We were all young, yes.
We were all young then. Yes, in fact, it's great because he had been studying with his elders. He had had a return to seeking out his own traditions, and he had moved back to his home community in Mashpee and had been studying with his elders. And so when the Quakers were going to have that yearly gathering, they contacted his Wampanoag community, some of the elders there, and his elders said, well, we think it's time for you to go out and speak. And so it was his first public speaking engagement. He was there with his partner, Migamahan, with their first child, who was 2 at the time. And she was playing around in the back of the room with her mom while he was speaking. And so, what happened was I told him about this. He was willing to give me some names of people that we might contact here in Maine and in the Maritimes. And he also took it upon himself to correspond with me throughout the next year, really trying to educate me. I was so naive. I was so uneducated. I just was going on pure instinct and interest. And he really took the time to educate me. And so we began to think about how to move this a step further. And so the idea arose to have not really a gathering, we might have called it that, but it was more of an educational forum where we invited, Wabanaki is the term that is used to refer to all of the tribes in Maine and the Maritimes.
But I'm glad you explained that because not everybody listening would be from Maine. And
right, there are 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Micmac, and Maliseet, and also the Abenaki, but they don't have they're not federally recognized in Maine. But they are all comprise the Wabanaki. And so we had invited several Wabanaki speakers to speak, to educate us, basically us non-natives, and to talk about not only our history together, but their current issues in their lives. And so we did this. It was pretty successful. We did it again the following year. But at the end of that second session, some of the Wabanaki participants came up to me as I was that's what I was the coordinator of, was this event.
Right.
And they said, we think this has promise, but if we're going to stay involved, we would like to suggest that we meet a different way. They said, we feel awkward being up there talking to you people, the audience down there. We would like to suggest that we meet in a more traditional way that we would be comfortable with. And so they invited us to meet in a traditional council circle. And with a talking stick, and that they would create it in a ceremonial way. So they would surround our meeting with ceremony to aid us in our discussions.
Shirley, what does that mean? I mean, what would that look like, that ceremony?
And I want to be really clear that this was at their invitation and they had complete responsibility for it. We would be invited guests, just as you might invite someone to your church.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be expected to come with respect and interest, but not there to take on what they saw there.
Right.
So they were completely in charge of that. And they said, you're in charge of getting the people here and finding the place. And so what we did was Gisatanamuk and others would arrive the night before, and they would start a sacred fire for us that would stay lit throughout the weekend. We would get up to a first light ceremony, and first light in May is extremely early. We began to meet twice a year, May and September. And these were long 4-day weekends. So we would arrive on a Thursday, the fire would already be lit. We would gather at first light for a ceremony around the fire where we would offer our prayers for the day. We would break for breakfast, and then we would come back and we would sit in a council circle for the rest of the morning. We would break for lunch. We would come back in the afternoon. We cooked together. We all brought food. We camped out. We hung out in the evenings. It was just an astonishing experience for many of us. And what would happen in those circles, there was no agenda. Usually Gisatanamuk would stand up and sort of talk about the protocol of the circle, how that we were speaking what was uppermost in our hearts and minds into the center of the circle, not to discuss or debate with someone else in the circle, but to simply speak from our hearts. And when we were done, we would pass the stick, and it would go around and it would go around again, and you could pass, and then you could speak. Some people didn't speak for years.
Wow. And there, as I'm remembering from the book, there were 7 indigenous people and 7 white people. Is that
in the book? So we would have, on a typical weekend, we would have maybe anywhere from 25 to 30 people.
Oh, okay.
And over the years, people would come and go. It wasn't always the same people, but there was a core group of us who came almost every time. We had 11 of these in all over a 6.5-year period.
Wow.
And so it was a lot of time spent together. And in between, we began to visit in each other's homes or help out with projects, or some of us created projects together that still exist. People would come and go, of course, but there was a core group of about 15 to 20. And so those of us who stayed in touch over the years, because the gatherings ended in 1993, but many of us stayed in touch. And so around 2008, some of us started talking about doing a book together.
Before you go there.
Right. Okay.
So it seems to me like it's just your passion and your interest that drew you into doing this work, and the fact that you had a partner, and I won't even try to say his name, and the spelling is extraordinary for us English speakers, but it didn't seem, I always ask heroines, you went on this incredible journey into the unknown. You had never done this before. Was there any trepidation or or did it just sort of work beautifully the way you went about it?
Both. Yes, there was much trepidation. It was, there was something about the way we came together, the commitment that we made to each other by simply showing up, for one thing, because people came from Cape Cod to Halifax, Nova Scotia. People traveled hours and hours to come to these gatherings, which we tried to hold as close to the indigenous communities as possible, just out of consideration for their time and travel. So people traveled long distances, made the commitment of these long weekends. And it was, and then this coming together to sort of say our prayers for the day in the morning and to be held in that circle during the day. There was that was holding us. And even more than that, I think it was the vulnerability and the risk taking that happened around that fire, that that people stayed. I mean, after a while and we got comfortable with one another, people began to feel safe to express their anger, their hurt, the indigenous people, particularly the non-native people, began to feel safe to express the ways that we felt alienated from the land, from our families, what we all collectively felt was happening to the earth. I mean, it was like weaving together this fabric that got stronger and stronger.
Right.
So all I can say is that, and I say this in the book, that there were times that I felt that there was a wound being healed that I didn't know was there, a wound between our peoples, that we could be so honest and open with each other, that it felt, that I didn't know was there until I felt it healing. And I think so many of us felt that, that it kept us coming back. We really wanted to feel that. And so when you feel that kind of rightness, you start to feel like you just have to keep at this, even though it was difficult. I mean,
right.
The planning, the commitment. There were times in the circle that I thought, when I would go to bed at night in my tent, that I would be afraid when I woke up, everyone would have packed up and gone home, because there was anger expressed there. People, somebody would say something and someone would get triggered. But the important thing was none of us left. We just kept staying. And
you created that container, that sacred container to do this.
I didn't, but the circle did. Yes.
Everyone. Yeah. Yes. To do sacred work. So, all right, then let you talk about the book and how that, so there you were, having had this, sounds to me like a mountaintop experience, what was created by all of you. And then you said, and so to me, this is your next heroine's journey, that you were called. Say more about how the book got going.
I will. Okay. There was something I wanted to say before we left the gatherings.
Yes.
And that is that I think it's important for people to hear that you don't need to meet as we did for this kind of thing to happen. That I think we were greatly supported by what the Wabanaki people offered us, but you don't need to be in a traditional Wabanaki or indigenous circle. You can create that sort of bonding anywhere among peoples, I believe. And so I don't want to give the impression that that's the only way it can happen. But in terms of our groups with our tragic history coming together, it seemed very important that we meet in a way that the Wabanaki people suggested. And that's what they offered to us. And we offered to let go of any preconceived notions we had about how you get together.
Right.
And I think that was part of the magic.
I'm glad you clarified that, because in my mind, as a former facilitator who has worked with groups in conflict and who needed to work to understand each other, I was thinking, oh, if all of those groups could have met in that way. But I hear you that, it would stop people from meeting if they thought it had to be that way every time. And what's most important is to find a way to gather.
Is the intention, I think, and the commitment to stay with it.
Right.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we wrote the book, is we hope that people could lift some of the principles and apply it in other situations.
Right. Definitely. So how did this come about?
Well, first of all, let me say that I do not ever say it's my book.
Right.
That I always say it's our book.
Right.
And
right.
Yes, right there. Yes.
Wow.
And I'll tell the story of how we came up with the name and the cover. But as I said, many of us stayed in touch over the years, and the gatherings ended in 93, but in around 2008, my friend Frances, who is from New Zealand and lived here during the time of the gatherings and was very much a part of them, she came back for a visit. And I was driving from New Zealand, and I was driving her around Maine and New Brunswick, and we were visiting old friends from the gatherings. And we talked, and as we met with people, we sort of, I had said to her that ever since the gatherings ended, I had this image, this idea that someone needed to write a book about this experience, that we had learned so much from each other. But I was really clear it wasn't me, because I could imagine the work involved. It just felt like a mountain to climb.
And you were teaching, right, at the time?
I was working for the university at the time. And so that was another thing. I just felt it was impossible. However, I retired in 2008. So
you had nothing to do.
Oh, right. Yes. But still, it felt like way too much to take on. And my friend Frances happens to be a writer. And she also does her writing primarily with Maori and Pacific Islander populations in New Zealand. And that's what she does. And she said, I'll come back. I'll come back and I'll spend a couple of weeks and we'll interview people and I'll write the book. I said, great. And, it's so funny because all during that period from 93 to 2008, I told you I'd always had this image. At one point, I had a box in my basement of all of the archives from the gatherings, all of the invitations and notes and recordings and all kinds of things. And there was even one woman who ultimately becomes part of the book, who had, I was talking with her one day, and she said she had been working on a history of the institution where she was working. I said, oh, great. Why don't you write a history? Why don't you write about the gathering? She said, okay. So I just remember this night that she drove to my house from Biddeford to my house in Portland, and I put this box of stuff in her back seat, and off she drove. And then hilariously, like a few years later, she's visiting me again and she brings the box back.
The box was too much, too
The
much.
box was too much. And I know why. And so anyway, so when Frances made this offer, I said, oh, this is great. And because I just knew this needed to happen. So we and I started talking to people. Several of us wound up in an event up at the University of Maine in Orono. We talked about it. People started getting excited about this. And Frances writes a lot of grants in her work. So she and I wrote some grants together. I got money together for our first reunion of, we identified 10 people who had said they'd like to be part of this. And it was always critical that it be an even number of Wabanaki and non-native people doing the book. And so we had 10 people lined up for this reunion gathering. Frances was going to fly from New Zealand.
Right.
And we'd raised all this money. And a week or two before, she calls me and says, I'm having emergency eye surgery. And my physician says, I'm not flying anywhere for at least a year. And we were so far down the road, and I consulted with people and they said, oh, we're not stopping now. And so it just became obvious that this was going to be my work to do.
And what was the feeling at that point? Because you had tried, and in the journey, we call it refusal of the call.
It was refusal.
You can do it. You can do it. And now it's like, oh no. So how did you feel at that point that I've got to shoulder this?
It was frightening. It was frightening. It's like you see the writing on the wall and you don't want to read it, because suddenly in my life, I'm suddenly retired. This is the year that I retired.
Wow.
I was the coordinator of the gatherings. I was the one who lived here. I know everybody in the, it just made sense.
Were you a writer? Had you written a book?
I had never, oh yeah, that's a great, well, I had written in my profession, of course, but more technical writing, papers, and I had never taken on anything like this. Plus people, as I said, we lived hours from one another, but people said, we are in this and you can do it, and we will be behind you. And we created a planning group of Gisatanamuk, his partner Migamahan, Wayne Newell, who is a Passamaquoddy elder, and Frances and myself. So we had our first reunion gathering at Wayne's home, and it was just amazing. And we talked about the book. We made plans for interviews. We talked about 4 others that we would like to be in the book with us. So we checked in with them. So we wound up with 14 plus Frances, who had agreed to, from afar, be a supporter and guide and mentor. She certainly was to me.
Yeah.
Faithfully. And so raised more money, and I embarked on doing the interviews.
Right. And really then 2 weeks later, just the way Frances had said, you wrote the book.
2 weeks. Yeah. Yes.
Didn't she say, I'll come and in 2 weeks we'll write it? Is that true?
No, she said, I'll come and we'll do the interviews in 2 weeks.
Okay.
But still, it's when I think about, because it was a really long process, traveling. And I want to say also, really importantly, as I said, I wanted more than anything for it to be our book. And we all wanted that. And there's such a history of non-native people collecting the stories of indigenous culture, spirituality, life ways, and benefiting from it in some way, going off and getting a degree or selling a book, and nothing comes back. And we didn't want that. I didn't want that. And I just said, the most important thing is that we finish together and people feel as if it's our book. And so it was really important that these interviews, I would come back and transcribe them. I would send them back to people, and they had full authority over their words. They could subtract, add, whatever they wanted. Then when there was a process of crafting a story from the interview, and then I would send that first draft back to them and get their approval for that. And so that process took a couple of years. And then, well, let me say first, the process of gathering the stories, going back and forth. And once I had all of those, then we met again and we talked about the structure of the book. So we together talked about what are the themes that are emerging, what are the lessons we feel we learned. And so people had input into what the book would look like. Then I went off, and it took about 3 years to write the book, because again, it was going back and forth. Right. Wayne and Gisatanamuk and Migamahan particularly sort of acted as cultural advisors. So if I had questions about what something meant, or I tried very hard to only speak for myself or the non-native people in the book. And when it was something attributed to the Wabanaki participants, to make sure that they had said that themselves, that I wasn't, making up, attributing things.
And so you said you were going to tell us how the cover came to be.
Yes.
The story that goes with that.
Yeah. It takes a little while to get a publisher. That's another whole story. Right. But to our great delight, the University of Toronto Press got interested in our book. And they have told us, they have a huge Indigenous studies department in their publishing company. And they told us that they felt this book was unique, that they didn't have anything that was first-person stories about what it's like, the nitty-gritty of being in relationship, the little things, the big things, the awkwardness, the joy, the uncertainty, of trying to understand one another. Yeah. And so they really loved it. And so we were very grateful for that. And they were very sensitive to our wishes and desires, and fully engaged our planning group with the cover. And so we love the cover. I remember saying, we met with their marketing team, and I remember saying, well, the colors in our part of the world are green and blue, it's trees and water. And so they created an image of us of interlapping but separate circles in those colors, which we loved. And then we said, and everyone's name has to be on the cover. And they said, oh, really? We said, yes, they all have to be on the cover. And they said, okay. And so they sent us back a mock-up of the cover, and they had everyone's name on it. And we said, that looks terrible. Right. Too big, too much. And they said, so, well, could you come up with a name for the group? Something that shows visually that this is a collaborative effort. So the cover has my name and Melbiane. And the coming up with the name for the group is it's a wonderful story because I certainly couldn't do that. And so several of our Wabanaki co-authors are native speakers. In other words, they grew up with their language as their first language. And so and Mi'kmaq and Wayne, both in our planning group, are native speakers. And so I happened to be able to get both of them on the phone at the same time, which was a minor miracle. They're busy people. And I told them the dilemma, and I got to just sit on this phone call and listen to the two of them discuss what the name should be. And it was just a moment I wish I had recorded.
Yeah.
Because Wayne is Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq is Mi'kmaq, and they talked about what the circle was, what we had done, and then how they could come up with a word that would be recognizable in all four Wabanaki languages, and with enough of a root that people would recognize. And so Wayne made a suggestion, and it's the very, very first short paragraph in the preface. So if I could just read this.
Yes, please do.
This is what he told us on that phone call. Mobiane in Passamaquoddy literally means let us sit together. But the deeper meaning is of a group coming together, as in the Longhouse, to struggle with a sensitive or divisive issue. The word indicates an urgency to meet because the outcome is something very desirable, such as resolving a conflict or bringing about peace. It's a healing word.
Wow. And let me so it's this word, and you pronounce it for us again.
Mobiane.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That is the best of my ability. Wayne coaches me every time I say it.
It's beautiful. And so what I want to ask you now, Shirley, is, so just congratulations. For all of you, the effort, the time, energy that was spent, it's just beautiful to hear about it. Back to your journey, and maybe this is hard to encapsulate, but I think you could find something that you could read in the book. I always ask women, well, what's the gift you receive from this journey? How did it enrich your life? We go on the journey to learn, to change, to evolve. What happened for you? Then don't you have a piece that you could read?
Yeah, I can. There are many gifts. There are many gifts to this. And I would say one of the biggest gifts is that I feel we're all still in relationship.
Yeah.
That I got an experience of doing this collaboratively with this group of people. And we've lost 5 people.
I know
Yeah.
you have, yes.
Yes.
And one, Debbie Layton, very dear to my heart, a friend of mine. And I want to just say out loud, I'd like to dedicate this particular podcast to Debbie Layton, who passed away this year.
Yes, that's lovely. We all miss her.
Mm.
Yeah. So the fact that those relationships grew stronger through the creation of this book. And I'm getting to do presentations with people from the book, which has been just wonderful. And so that is one big gift. But at the end of my personal story in the book, I write, being in relationship with Native people means that you will inevitably be drawn into the political dimension of their world and must choose whether to take on a particular cause as your own. One aspect of white privilege is having the choice of whether to become involved, whereas in most cases they do not. But I came to understand over time that their issues are my issues, and not only because of my love for specific individuals. Our social and economic policies have made Native communities most vulnerable, but they are simply the canary in the coal mine, perhaps especially when it comes to environmental concerns. What is impacting their communities will soon impact all of us. My experience in the gatherings changed the way I look at everything: news events, historical accounts, politicians' promises, scientific claims. I could go on. Everywhere, I see the absence of the indigenous perspective, the lack of which means we are all poorer, even in peril. What the dominant culture knows and values, even our ways of knowing, seem clearly deficient in terms of sustaining our life here on this planet. We need the indigenous perspective, but that perspective has to be honorably earned and freely given.
Oh, that's beautiful. And just think about how it happened. You went to that conference, you were inspired, you just began reaching out, meeting people, and look at what unfolded as a result. It's inspiring for sure. And so I'm wondering, Shirley, there are people listening to this who are perhaps feeling a call to do something similar or to broaden their world in some way like you did. And what would you, they're hesitating. They're right there on the threshold thinking, oh, I don't know. Remember what you said, well, talking about the book. I'm not a writer. You do it, not me. They might be doing the same thing. How would you encourage them?
Well, I guess I would say to them, imagine not doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, that was what I, it might not be, it might not be the most exciting way to approach this, but to truly sit and imagine not doing this, not bringing whatever it is
Right.
into the world. And that's what I had to do. I had to sit with that and say, if I don't do this, our whole experience. I used to have this little quote in my desk drawer. So when I had a desk drawer, so when I pulled it out, it was taped inside, and it was a quote from Elie Wiesel.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, not to transmit an experience is to betray it.
Wow.
And, I think that's it. It's like when I thought about not writing this book or it not getting written, I just couldn't bear it. And so I had to do it.
How could you not? Right. Well, that is wonderful. And so everyone, I would encourage you, and we're going to be putting this as part of Shirley's information when we send out this video, how to get the book, which you can get University of Toronto Press and on Amazon, and more particular
stores have, all your local bookstores will
Right.
be able to get it.
Right. And it's the website that I would encourage everybody to look at, because you'll get so much more information, is thegatheringsbook.com. So, and then we can also find you on Facebook and on Instagram. But again, I'll put all that in the information. But I just love this story, and I love what you've done, and just kudos to you. Kudos to all of you that accomplished this great, wonderful conversation. Yeah. So thank you for being with me today.
My pleasure. Susan.
Mine too. Okay. And the rest of you, if you would please make sure that you continue to watch. We'll have another podcasts coming up soon. So thank you all for being with Shirley and with me today.
Thank you for listening to the podcast for Real Life Heroines with Susanna Liller. We're so glad you've joined us and would love to connect with you outside of the show. To find more about Susanna and how she can assist you in your heroine story, go to susannaliller.com/blog or find us on social media and YouTube by searching Susanna Liller. You can also email us directly at susanna@susannaliller.com. We'd love to hear from you. To be encouraged and inspired outside of the show and blog, check out You Are a Heroine, a retelling of the hero's journey written by your host and coach, Susanna, available on Amazon. Until the next time, be well, heroine.